You'll see Carole Lombard and Robert Montgomery together for the first time. You'll see one of the funniest comedy situations that ever hit the screen. You'll see what happens when Mr. and Mrs. Smith discover that they were never legally married.
Welcome to another episode of Foreign Correspondents Deeper into Hitchcock podcast. My name is Michał Oleszczyk and I'm joined as always by my co-host
Sebastian Smoliński. Hello.
This is the 25th episode of our podcast. We are slowly reaching the midpoint of Alfred Hitchcock's filmography, and we discuss each Hitchcock film in his filmography in the chronological order, trying to add a little bit of Eastern European perspective to it. Today, we have a special treat for you, a special guest that we will introduce in a second. However, first of all, let's discuss the film briefly ourselves. The film is Mr. and Mrs. Smith, not to be confused with the Brangelina, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And the film stars Robert Montgomery and, crucially, Carole Lombard. We will be talking later in the episode with Olympia Kiriakou, who wrote a book, Becoming Carole Lombard. We will be talking about the star persona of this wonderful actress, prematurely deceased, and about this particular movie and its place in Carole Lombard canon and in Alfred Hitchcock canon. The first thing to know about Mr. and Mrs. Smith is that it's a screwball comedy. It's a film that doesn't seem like a Hitchcock film at all. It's a pure comedy with no suspense elements, and it fits very nicely with the general themes of screwball, such as the comedy of remarriage. Carole Lombard and Robert Montgomery play a married couple who have a sudden realization, or rather discovery, that they are not truly married after all, that the certificate that they got a few years ago is not actually valid. So there's this question whether they will remarry again and how they will handle the information between them, because they learn about it separately. And there's a little bit of suspense in how each of them will deal with this fresh knowledge of actually being single. Will they remarry or not? The whole comedy is built around that. So before we talk to Olympia, Sebastian, did you like the movie?
I'm so about it, to be honest. But I think that the great part of rewatching this film was also rewatching Carole Lombard on screen. And Carole Lombard is magnificent as always.
Absolutely. She's one of the key comedians of 1930s. She played in movies such as 20th Century by Howard Hawks, Nothing Sacred by William Wellman, My Man Godfrey, directed by Gregory LaCava, Hands Across the Table by Mitchell Lyson, and many others. Unfortunately, her life was tragically cut short in a famous accident. She was only 33 when she passed away, and we will talk about this, of course, with Olympia. I was also a little bit disappointed by this film. I remember watching it many years ago, at least 20 years ago, and back then it seemed to me very witty, very funny. I really enjoyed it. Now I think, as I became, a little bit more discerning in my taste for screwball, I think it's definitely one of the lesser screwball comedies. Norman Krasna, the screenwriter of it, also wasn't the top screenwriter of the time, although he wrote many movies. And this film also, I think, and we will explore it a little bit more later on, has a big streak of misogyny playing in the background. I think that, especially the way Hitchcock treats other women in the film, but also a little bit Carole Lombard, especially by stressing how much she gained weight in between the fake marriage and now, by giving us big close-ups of her dress seams, of her dress coming at the seams. I thought, okay, Hitch, you probably were gaining a lot of weight yourself at that time, and you are transferring it onto this female character. But I think, he was actually doing that in a little bit ungraceful even way, especially since this was his leading lady. There are moments that I enjoy still in the film, but I would say it's one of those lesser screwball comedies which will forever hold the fascination of being directed by Hitchcock, because it's such a unusual Hitchcock project. probably we would have to compare it to one of the silent films that were almost like comedies, like Farmer's Wife, for example. But so yes, it will forever remain the single comedy, pure comedy, suspense-less in Hitchcock's oeuvre.
Exactly, and there is this paradox that, for example, Peter Bogdanovich mentioned, that if you don't know it's a Hitchcock movie, you probably won't know, without reading the credits. But if you do know, then you can approach it from that perspective, and you can look for these signs of Hitchcock's mastery or Hitchcock's signature. So, maybe it's a bit of a convoluted way of claiming that it's another of this auteur's movies.
So let's explore it now with Olympia Kiriakou, the author of Becoming Carole Lombard, a truly pioneering study of this particular and very beloved star's persona. We will be joined by Olympia via Zoom.
We are super excited to have you as a scholar, not a Hitchcock scholar per se, but we are also very excited that we can approach his films from different perspectives. And it's, I think, also very exciting that your book is so new, so fresh. It's your PhD dissertation, right?
Yes, yeah, I wrote it and then I adapted it to the book.
So I know it's a result of many years of research and of many years of being with Carole Lombard and everything that was written or recorded about her. So if we could start by, talking about your story, your adventure with this book, with this project. What brought you to it, and what was the most pleasant part of it and the most difficult one of writing a first, scholarly book, as you mentioned in the introduction, the first scholarly book about Carole Lombard.
So I've been researching and been basically a fan of Carole Lombard since I was maybe like 19 or so. When I was in my undergrad in college, I had an opportunity. I got a grant from my university to go to the Library of Congress to do some research. So I had worked on a project on some of her silent comedies with Max Sennett. And so I finished that project. I put Carole on the back burner while I was doing my master's. And then I picked up the project again for my PhD because I really felt that, well, Carole Lombard's a very popular screwball comedian. There's been very little written about her in terms of her other work and her star persona. So I really wanted to dive into those aspects of her career more deeply. I think the best part was getting to watch some, as I said before, some of her silent films. A lot of these are unfortunately in archives, so they're not necessarily accessible to the average person. But I had it was such an honor to watch some of these films and to see the sort of the how her performance, her performative abilities evolved. And so that was really cool. I think the hardest part, whenever you write about a Hollywood star, especially from that classical era, so much of the information about them is filtered through like the studio publicity departments and fan magazines. So everything you read about them as a person, you kind of have to think, well, how much of this has been edited to fit like a certain persona. So always having to keep that in mind when dealing with aspects of her career off the screen and her star persona, her marriages, for example. So, and especially difficult with someone like Lombard, who never gave really any candid interviews. She didn't have a diary, so it was challenging in that respect, but I worked through it.
Yeah, and we get to know more about her thanks to your research and, for example, the surrounding events behind the accident, right? You try to establish the exact date. That was something very interesting for me, and I saw a few of her, most of her screwball comedies, not many other movies, but I saw these, and I was surprised, for example, to discover that this accident had such an impact in the 20s on her career. And basically, I think your argument, before we'll approach Mr. and Mrs. Smith, I think your argument is very interesting, that we should maybe separate her slapstick period from her screwball period. And that's, if you could maybe say a bit about it for those listeners who haven't read your book yet. Why do you think that's the case, and was it difficult to argue that against many scholars or just commentators who treat it as one?
Definitely. So for those of you who are not familiar with Carole Lombard, she worked for Max Sennett from 1927 to 1929. And then her first screwball comedy wasn't until 1934. So you have this fairly substantial period in her late silent, early sound career where she didn't make really any comedies, certainly not anything resembling screwball. During that period, she had just signed to Paramount, and they sort of positioned her as like a glamour girl almost. She had a very refined and sophisticated star persona, very different from what audiences would have known in the mid to late 30s. And so for me, I always found it very curious when I've read scholars argue that there's some sort of connection between her slapstick and her screwball work because of that huge chunk in her career. And really during that time, that 5-year period, I think Paramount really didn't know what to do with her as a star, her as a performer. There was no real indication during that period that she was going to be a comedian. So to make that connection between her slapstick and her screwball work is really, I think, kind of unfounded. And never mind that I don't want to go into sort of like the technicalities of slapstick and screwball, but they are fairly different genres of comedy. So while you can definitely identify some elements of slapstick in her later screwball work, particularly the physical comedy, they are very distinct periods of her career.
I also wanted to ask about how slowly approaching Mr. and Mrs. Smith, because this is not a film usually that is mentioned in the Carole Lombard canon. I mean, we usually think of her work with Gregory LaCava or Mitchell Leisen or Ernst Lubitsch, but here there's this unlikely connection that Alfred Hitchcock actually directs a screwball comedy. He directs Carole Lombard, and he delivers a film that's probably unlike any other film that he made. But how do you approach this film? Is it a lesser Lombard film, or is it a typical Lombard production of that time? Where would you place it in let's say Carole Lombard canon?
I place it. It's not necessarily as physical as her other screwball comedies. Carole Lombard, compared to some of her contemporaries, physical comedy was a huge part of her performance. So it's in a different category than, let's say, like a Nothing Sacred, where she's very active and combative, and even with My Man Godfrey. But I think it has still those elements of, the remarriage plot, of course. It's very sophisticated type of comedy. So I think I categorize it as a screwball with like a little asterisk, maybe.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think she was so attracted to Hitchcock as a director? Why did she think that, that was a good idea to invite him? Because that's the regular story about this film, right? That she wanted to work with Hitchcock and he did it as a courtesy. So I'm not asking what did she think, but why do you think that based on, her ever and Hitchcock's ever? Where are these connections? Where do these sensibilities meet, in your opinion?
That's a good question. And I think when you watch Mr. and Mrs. Smith, it doesn't seem like a Hitchcock film at all, but I think there are still those elements of like the slyness and sort of like the witty comedy that you do get in Hitchcock's more, the thrillers, for example. And I think that, I can't speak for Carole Lombard, but I think maybe she saw that and thought that maybe that could be translated into like a, feature film. And I think, Hitchcock's reputation at that point, he was, he's just in America, right? And so I assume for her, it was very exciting to be able to work with this, director that she really hadn't had very little contact with at that point. They were friends, they were friendly, but I think for her it was probably an exciting and new opportunity.
How do you feel about the screen partners of Lombard? In my perception, and of course I only know some of her films, but the tone of her performance depends very much on who is she paired with. She's quite different with John Barrymore in 20th Century. She's very different with Frederick March in Nothing Sacred. So here, Robert Montgomery, who wasn't, let's say the true leading man of screwball comedies, I would say he was sort of a second tier in that canon. How do you perceive her in pairing with him as his screen partner?
Personally, it's not my favorite screen pairing. I don't know if they necessarily. Obviously, their relationship is adversarial in the film, but I still don't know if there is that much chemistry between the two. So it's hard for me personally as a viewer to sort of buy into the relationship between Anne and David Smith. I don't know. I think in that respect, for me personally, it's, as we talked about before, it's a screwball comedy. I classify it as one of her screwball comedies, but I think it's one of the weaker ones because of that relationship, because she doesn't have that that chemistry like she does with a William Powell or even a Frederick March. So while it's enjoyable, it's not my favorite.
Yeah, I also think about Montgomery more as this noir figure, right? Not a screwball one. So I had this feeling, and I don't know if any of you agree, that his friend, the lawyer he's working with, he needs to be even more stiff than the Robert Montgomery character to make Robert Montgomery at least a bit adventurous, right? There has to be this juxtaposition to make him more interesting when he's next to Lombard.
Absolutely. I think there's, like, as you said, there's like a hardness to Robert Montgomery's performance that I don't know if it necessarily meshes that well with Lombard's style. And then Gene Rayburn, he's obviously he's supposed to be, a weak character. He doesn't really have a backbone, and we see that culminate in their final scene together. But yeah, I think there's something missing even with him too. I don't know if I was Anne, I don't know if I'd really care that much to be with either of them. Neither of them are particularly interesting male characters.
Mm-hmm. There's also this running trope of a Hitchcock blonde throughout Hitchcock's oeuvre, and probably the epitome of that is Tippi Hedren or Kim Novak. Usually Hitchcock is quite punishing in his relationship to those characters, and usually to the actresses as well who played those characters. Can we fit Carole Lombard into that lineage of Hitchcock blondes? Is she a version of a Hitchcock blonde, or is she a different creation, different creature altogether?
I think she definitely, for me, is a little bit different, and I think the relationship that she had with him was also different. I think she sort of took that relationship that he was known for to have with his actresses and kind of pushed back on that. For example, she brought cattle to the set and she put little name tags on each of the cows. One said Carole Lombard, one said Robert Montgomery, one said Alfred Hitchcock, to play upon his, actors are like cattle statement. She was also the only person, I believe, that ever directed his cameo. So she had a little bit of agency in that filmmaking process. For those of you who haven't seen the film, Hitchcock comes out of David and Anne's apartment and the camera pulls back and you see Hitchcock walking down the street. Carole directed that, and allegedly she kind of was, egging him on a little bit, saying, that's terrible, we got to keep doing it again. So they did 20, 30 takes of that just to sort of play with him.
Yeah, that's a great anecdote, and I also I've read in Leonard Jeff's book about Hitchcock, this anecdote that they had very good relationship on set, and that Hitchcock, maybe that could be something disappointing for him, but he couldn't embarrass her. She was, and once again we come back to the first part of your book, to the 1920s, the flapper figure and this outgoing, very brave girl, and he couldn't embarrass her. He coming from this more prudish or equally prudish, but in different sense, British culture, they were almost like equals. So I think that's also a very nice story of a working relationship that was, of course, cut too fast, right? I mean, abruptly by the tragic accident in which Carole Lombard died. But there are these fantasies about Lombard as a Hitchcock heroine. I mean, some people fantasize what could happen later in the 40s, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's one of the things that I think about so often is, had she lived, what her career might have become. And I often wonder, what would she have been like in, for example, a film noir or even, a Hitchcock thriller, right? I think she had the capability to play those types of roles. We see that a little bit in her late career, in her late 1930s, early 1940s career, where she transitioned from screwball to drama. And so I think that might have been a natural progression for her. So it's always heartbreaking to think such a missed opportunity professionally.
Yeah, I always kind of imagine that her career might have taken similar route to Barbara Stanwyck's, who late in career she had those TV appearances, and it's such a tremendous loss that career was cut short.
Yeah, but I think also Lucille Ball is one of the inheritors of Lombard, right?
Absolutely. Yes, so they were actually very good friends, and Carole was her mentor. And in Lucille Ball's, one of her autobiographies, she says that Carole allegedly came to her in a dream and sort of encouraged her to pursue I Love Lucy. And you can definitely see similarities in their comedic styles. So I can imagine that, Lombard, when she died, she was 33. Unfortunately, Hollywood doesn't really allow women to age very gracefully. So I can imagine she would have had to transition into perhaps away from the leading lady into something else, whether it be, production, television, as you said, following, a Barbara Stanwyck's footsteps, transitioning into another type of role. So it's interesting to think of the possibilities.
Mm-hmm. So probably this line between noir heroine and screwball heroine wasn't as clear, right? And or generally between comedy and more serious modes, as Barbara Stanwyck shows. And I wanted to ask you both actually about the sexual innuendos we find in this film. Of course, we find them in almost every Hitchcock movie, but in this case, the story is interesting because many American critics were kind of proud of Hitchcock, that he made this very American movie, which is his first film set in New York. The very first image is Manhattan skyline, or big buildings in Manhattan, and he could do something very American, but at the same time, I would argue that there are some British traits, like this. For example, his nastiness towards female characters. I think it's something he actually brought from UK. But my question is, does it work for you still? I mean, can you sense it as this screwball, quite a late screwball comedy, early 40s, that still wants to play with the code in some ways? Is it something you feel when you watch this film?
Absolutely. I think the allusions to sex are so potent in this film. One that stands out for me in particular, and I write about it in my book, is the very final scene where they're in the ski lodge, and Carole Lombard's character, Anne, she's having trouble putting on her skis, and at some point she's sort of feigning she's difficulty. She can get her ski on, but she wants David to help her. And then eventually he does, and the camera cuts to a shot of her skis sort of crisscrossing, and that's how the film ends. And so I think that's sort of this allusion to sex, what's going to happen next. We don't have to say it explicitly, right? And so I think in that way, where, you have traditional screwball comedy, the sort of physicality is that allusion to sex. In Hitchcock's, in Mr. and Mrs. Smith, it's that sort of the more subtle visual innuendo. I mean, and that's just one example. It's throughout the film, but I think that's the most explicit.
Right. I also think that this is a rather late screwball comedy. It's a wartime film, right? It was made during the war. I think it's on the very sort of tail end of this, except of course for late masterpiece, which is Adam's Rib. But here I think that it's also depending on the quality of the writing, and I think that the screenplay by Norman Krasna is it has its better moments and its worst moments. It's not the most brilliant script. He wrote many movies which were sort of like this middle shelf of dialogue and brilliance, let's say. But one last question that I had to do also with this particular moment in the reception of Carole Lombard's career. How was she received at that particular time? She was definitely seen as one of those screwball ladies in the 1930s, and then she played in another wartime film, which is To Be or Not to Be. But what was she seen as in 1941 by the American public?
So Mr. and Mrs. Smith is actually a very pivotal point in that late career. In 1937, her contract with Paramount ended, and it was at that time where she basically said, I'm tired of being typecast as a screwball comedian. I want to move into drama. So from 1939 to 1940, she made 4 back-to-back dramas. And unfortunately, while they were critical successes, the public didn't really accept her in those types of roles. They kind of wanted more screwball from Carole. And so I think the poor box office performances of those films really turned her off from pursuing more of those types of projects. So Mr. and Mrs. Smith, it was the last film that she made in a 3-picture deal with RKO. And that was essentially her return to comedy. And I think in that way, it was sort of her coming home. It was a very comfortable type of role. Well, it's not screwball as we talked about before. It's not screwball in like the My Man Godfrey kind of sense. It was a much more familiar type of role that, audiences would have wanted to see her in. And so I think for her in that way, this film was an enjoyable one to make.
And also to comment upon it, also in your book, in the chapter about her screwball comedies, you pursue this line that maybe there were some personal reverberations of this film, meaning that, she was now a wife, I think, right? Wife of Clark Gable, or just a partner?
They were married, yes.
So that this film in a way also may mirror, their mature relationship, right? That there's these parameters of stardom were kind of connecting these two spheres.
Absolutely, yes. She began dating Clark Gable in 1936, and they got married in 1939. And so by that point, by 1939 to 1942, when she died, there was this sort of tension between maintaining her own, I think, independent identity and then being labeled as, Mrs. Clark Gable. And I think you get that same sense with Anne and Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and that, she still loves David. I think that's quite clear by the end of the film, but she does also like that taste of independence. And so you do see those parallels between, screen character and, off-screen persona, right? They're really merging in such a unique way in this film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have like 1 or 2 questions to wrap up slowly, but yeah, I think we, one of the, let's say, aims of our meeting could be to claim that Mr. and Mrs. Smith is a forgotten masterpiece of Hitchcock and Carole Lombard, but apparently that's not really the case. I think all of us have this more of a lukewarm approach to this film, and Hitchcock conveniently almost went outside of the picture of our conversation, which is very fine because, part of your study and of contemporary studies of Hollywood is to decenter directors, right? After so many decades of them being at the center. My biggest problem with this film is probably pacing. I just watching Mr. and Mrs. Smith and then watching Gregory Lacava's or Howard Hawks' movies make it clear that, at least in this case, Hitchcock wasn't up to the task when it comes to the timing. That's the biggest problem I have with this film. But also, I cannot stop thinking that this, let's say, perfect setup of this marital problems in a single apartment, because apartment plays an important role in this film, was elaborated by Hitchcock later, for example, in Rear Window. So maybe that film was, important in certain respects. That's more of an observation. But on a more personal note, I wanted to ask you about To Be or Not to Be, so the last Carole Lombard film, because I always tell to my US friends and Polish friends generally that it's probably the best classical Hollywood movie set in Poland, right? So just a simple question, do you like this film? I mean, do you find it enjoyable as much as we do?
Oh, absolutely. It's my favorite Carole Lombard film, and it's probably one of my favorite comedies from the 40s. I think it's spectacular. And I think Carole fits so well into that Lubitsch world. And I think unfortunately so many elements of it are still so relevant today. I always play it in one of my film history classes, and I'm so thrilled that my students always are so into it. They are so receptive of the film and of its comedy. It's fantastic.
The last thing, do you have any other book projects on your horizon? Because that was a huge thing, probably, that not probably, it was a huge book, a very important project. Do you have some other plans, professional plans now?
So I also, and aside from Carole, I also work a lot on Disney stuff. So I have a chapter coming out in the book next year. In terms of like a big project, I think I'm going to start tackling Clark Gable, in particular his politics. He was unfortunately very involved in HUAC. He was like one of basically the founding members of HUAC. He never testified. So I think that's like an element of his persona that needs to really be explored.
Interesting.
So
we'll be looking forward to that. Well, thank you so much. This was a real honor and a pleasure, and we are sure that this conversation will bring, even more attention to both to your book and to Carole Lombard, who unfortunately passed away so early, but she, left all those wonderful roles. So it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed talking about Mr. and Mrs. Smith and Carole with you both.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. It was really wonderful to have Olympia as our guest. I feel that the subjects that we were talking about were very illuminated by her presence. So I think we all agreed that it's not our favorite Hitchcock film. Next episode, we will discuss Suspicion, which definitely has more of a suspenseful streak. We will be seeing Cary Grant, and we'll be rejoining Joanne Fontaine, who was already in Hitchcock's Rebecca. Are you looking forward to Suspicion?
Oh, very much so. Mostly because I like Cary Grant in this, noirish style. So I think it's gonna be a treat, and I'm very happy that I will revisit that one with you.
Absolutely, I'm also looking forward to it, and we encourage you to watch it in the meantime. And if ever anyone gives you a glass of glowing milk, don't drink it. So this was Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the 25th episode of Foreign Correspondence.
Deeper into Hitchcock.